player will.
Hey, welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. This is the Dario the Crystalborn character review, brand new character added to Global here within this last week. Very interesting new magic tank added, so very excited to talk about him. Today's presentation, very standard to what you might be used to seeing. It's the character overview, total stat analysis, where we go through all things from the base stats to the total stats to the individual metrics. You get the point, which will lead us to the report card where we grade those stats in the context of his kit, the rest of the characters, just to get some relative ideas of strengths and weaknesses. The general thoughts, where I can really kind of freely talk about a couple bullet points I want to hit on. We'll then go through the jobs, specifically with the passives, the counters, the job abilities, auto priority. We will look at the TMR for review, some job-based vision card eligibility, and the best, let's say rainbow team synergies or weapon-based synergies you could possibly put him in. We'll look at some general optimization, then 2 different sample builds in Truststones, so let's kick things off. Dario the Crystalborn is a new wind unit added here to Global with the Crystalborn Blade unique main job with Red Mage and Grimoire Keeper as the sub-jobs. He does equip katanas as his main weapon type, and able to equip armor, helm, and accessories, so obviously a heavier type of equipment rather than the cloth hat and accessory you might be used to seeing on most damage dealers. He does have a move of 3 and a jump of 1 as a 100 cost unit. The Faith recommendation, kind of similar to Dialdo. Way back when I did a big long presentation on Faith and how it impacts tanks in particular. You could really go as low as 30 in some instances or as high as 97 to maximize his damage and healing output. I'll be honest, for the average player, 97 Faith is totally just fine. I think it's really only upon strategic matchmaking decisions that you really should consider 50 Faith or 30 Faith, because it does affect the proc rate of certain kinds of buffs, which is why it's too much to consider necessarily in this one little section and very matchup specific. So generally speaking, you're fine at 97 Faith, but just know there are other options. Now for the attributes of the max range, 3 squares away is the furthest he can hit. He's got 1 AoE and 3 single target scaling abilities, so very short range as a tank. In terms of resistances here, his strongest is the 25% to magic. He comes in at 20% to slash, 15% to strike, certainly nice to see there as the 3 most common damage types. It's the 5% to pierce and then the minus 5% to missile, where he finally goes negative. Overall, very strong starting spots for resistances, but we know these are much smaller impact in the game nowadays compared to other kinds of survivability metrics. But for the ailment resistances, this is where that 97 Faith kind of comes back into the fold here, where he is 50% resistant innately to sleep. That will obviously help immensely against Helena, but the 10% to poison, certainly nice given the uptick in poison capable characters, and 50% to slow as well, which has kind of made a small resurgence across a variety of characters. The bottom line is, though, 3 excellent resistances for him to have, though. I like all 3 of these. The mastery ability, he's got a permanent 10% reduction of all magic scaling abilities, so that's obviously a fantastic thing to start off with as a magic tank. And he's got 5 AoE resistance innately. A little low, quite frankly, but 5 AoE resistance, will take it. For the 140 ability, they gave him 15% HP as well, and 30 elemental chain res is another type of survivability. We'll talk about all of these a little bit more later on in the presentation. Now, for the base stats overall, base HP, among the highest here. I think he's 3rd overall for base HP. He's technically an outlier on my box and whisker chart. Obviously a very strong starting point as a tank, where that means he can get to among some of the highest HP levels in the game, which you likely will observe in a variety of builds. From a base magic perspective, and yes, he's a magic scaling slash attack type unit. Think of Starlight Elena real quickly for those that might not be terribly familiar with that combination, but base magic, very low, which is kind of expected. Most tanks skew very low on their offensive output. They typically trade that off for a little bit more utility and survivability. That is obviously the case here with Dario, so I'm not terribly concerned with this base magic stat. That's really not a major consideration for any kind of build you should be looking at for him. For the base agility, again, kind of the same concept here. Not necessarily the end-all be-all for where agility ends up, but he's within these middle 2 tiers. That's really all you look for. If he was in 50 to 52, I'd be a lot more concerned, but he comes in at 54. Yes, it's on the low side, but there are other ways to recover from that. Now, for the base dexterity, also the same concept here. This obviously correlates to higher crit rates and higher accuracy, which tend to be some of the tank weaknesses, and that's also true for Dario here. He's below that 25th percentile. And general grouping for base dexterity, so he will skew much lower in both those attributes. And the base luck, a little bit above average here. You know, there's been a trend as of late where a lot of these characters get to be in this little higher bucket here of base luck. He's not exactly there. He's at the 75th percentile with a majority of the power creep characters post 3rd anniversary. This is not a good nor bad thing. This is a respectable amount of luck. I don't really think it changes anything. And we look at the total stats as we transform those charts into one here. The HP, again, is basically off the charts because I typically exclude the highest health pools, and he is one of them. So yeah, max bar. The rest of them, yeah, those are the weaknesses we saw. But again, tanks have a slightly different approach to how you want to look at their stats. When you include the board nodes, the mastery ability, things of that nature, you know, the luck takes a small step back. Obviously, the dexterity, the magic definitely do. But I'm not terribly concerned with these because the majority of these stats really don't have a high correlation to whether or not a tank can do their job or not. And just some visibility toward where he gets those stats. Yeah, 9 agility on the board. They do go a little higher on the HP side of things for the mastery ability and the 140 as we saw. But just know I'm okay with this. Now for the agility, he does have an agility passive that when you do consider the 15 and 8% main and subvision cards, he starts off at 75, which is a couple points below the average. But with his passive equipped, he ends up at 81, which is at the UR average of all agility options with passives equipped. So he can be into that slightly higher bucket, which is certainly a nice promising spot to be in. Again, one of those things that's very much in line with most tanks, so I'm not terribly concerned in that regard. The crit hit and crit avoid, you know, crit hit we already knew was going to be in the toilet. That's absolutely true. The crit avoidance, a little bit lower than average too for many of the tanks, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a weakness. He's basically where many of the characters start off at. Now for the accuracy, one of the worst accurate units in the game as well. That being said, his main ability on his job is a 100% hit chance. He technically has access to another one on the Grimoire sub, so yeah, you're going to want to invest some accuracy nodes of some kind, of either an Esper or a piece of equipment. We'll talk about that later, but yeah, the innate accuracy is very, very poor for this character overall. But again, that's kind of a recurring trend with many tanks as well, not necessarily outside the norm in the stereotypical tank build so far. The evasion, I would not consider him an evade unit either. He is on the very, very, very bottom hair of whatever could possibly mathematically done for evasion. That's not something I would really lean into when you're stress testing how high you can get up to, which brings us to the report card. And again, full disclosure, the grades here are very arbitrary because some of these grades you want to compare to the tanks. Some of these other grades you do want to compare to like the broader pool of characters. So don't get hyper focused on the grades here. Really just kind of like think through the bullet points more so than anything. And the effective HP, comparing him to your average tank, is actually average. It comes in at a C. Now there's a big change in the game kind of going on at the moment where a lot of the things we typically look at for effective HP, like defense and spirit and slash res and magic res and AoE res, a lot of those things are being switched out for more ability-based survivability. And this is true for Dario, this is true for a lot of other tanks. You'd be surprised that the highest effective HP tanks in the game are actually the very much power-crept ones. Characters like Engelbert and Warrior of Light. Yeah, those guys are off the charts for effective HP, but tank role has changed a little bit. And so mathematically speaking, he's average. Let's keep moving on though. 6 defense, 22 spirit with his main passive that you will have on all the time. You could get another 12 defense on another passive. He's got the 5 AoE res and 12 unit res on his main passive, which you will have on all the time. He does have 30% debuff weakening, the 30 elemental chain res, and 10% reduction of all magic damage taken, starting off at a good spot, quite honestly, for a lot of what this brings for the modern era of the game. And the survivability, you're going with a B. I'm going to go way more into this in the general thoughts, but he does have a nice HP barrier. He's got some self-healing. He's got a physical damage reduction capability. We'll talk about the intricacies of that soon, but just know that compared to most tanks, and I'm really thinking primarily of like Summer Glaciella, Raph, obviously the JP Uldoa that just got released is kind of in the back of my mind. It's actually a pretty good spot to be in for him. It's just that he skews way more heavily on the anti-magic side than the anti-physical side. Now, damage, again, kind of comparing to tanks, it's average. He's fine. He's right with everyone else. He's got no slash res pen innately. He does have access to 40 spirit penetration on a passive. You likely may not always have that on, though. His biggest damage upside really is just like the chain capping and finishing off a chain or starting a chain, where his main ability is a triple hit. So that's really where the big damage upside is. The rest of it, relatively inconsequential. The agility also going with a C here, 75 versus 78 average. With the passives, he's at that UR average of all units, not just tanks. So this is where I'm kind of apples to oranges comparing who my sample size is, but agility-wise, I'm pretty happy with him. Accuracy is definitely an F. The innate accuracy is absolutely awful. The main ability is the guaranteed hit. You also have another on the Grimoire sub-job, so there is some access for him to still do his job as intended. The evasion is D+, not an evade unit. I know most of you were probably looking at this so far being like, wow, Dario's probably trash. Hear me out though, guys. These stats are, for tanks, one small part of the picture. The movement's a B+ here. He's got a move +1 option on a passive. Definitely very nice. The auto ease of use is an A. Very easy AI. Low bait potential because of how short range he is. He brings some good utilities, relatively self-sufficient, very easy to use and plug and play for most people, I think. The game disruption, going with a B here. He's by far the best wind tank. He's a must-have for Katana in the future of that class. His biggest upside, though, is already on a downward trajectory, though, which is why I'm going with a B here, and that's mainly anti-magic metas. Now, here's the thing. The top end of the game, top 10 guilds or so, Helena VV and that magic meta is definitely subsiding. There's been enough counterplay introduced with A2 and Ashes of the Past and 2P, Young Eld. There's a whole bunch of answers already that are kind of being formulated that Dario doesn't do a whole lot to skew the overall game balance, objectively speaking. But for those of you that still see a lot of Helena VV throughout top 100 guild wars, he is excellent for that team. He will be fantastic in helping you counter them. But we just know the game balance is top down. Now, the passive abilities here are going with an A. Excellent main passive with a ton of versatility on the other ones. I like them a lot. The counter abilities is an A. He's got a decent sustained counter ability. He's got magic reflex also, and I typically just default to an A if you have a reflex ability. We've seen that even at a low proc rate, that will still win you and lose you so many fights. The overall dropping kick rate here, going with an A. Excellent magic tank, great utility, smart AI. It's not without counterplay though. He's not a broken, meta advancing tank that's a must pull for everyone. He's a highly recommended pull, don't get me wrong. But regardless, the overall jobbing kit is an A, and the final grade is an A-. He's a top tier magic tank, arguably the best in the game, that will definitely have lasting value as the game evolves. It might seem counterintuitive how we started off with the grading metrics here, but let's talk through the general thoughts where that might make some more sense. Because at the end of the day, the only question that has to be answered is, does he do a good job tanking, adding utility, providing some survivability, and altering the flow of battle? That's what a tank is supposed to do, and it's either yes or no. So the survivability factors, yeah, a lot of bullet points here. 7,500 HP barrier, and he can seal enemy barrier break upon hit. That's for his own barrier as well as teammate barriers. He's got a buff that will reduce physical and magical damage by up to 35% the larger the AoE. He is re-raise capable. He's got a 50% proc chance counter ability on a buff here to reduce physical damage by 30%. So you have a couple different ways he can reduce physical damage with this second bullet and this counter ability of the fourth. His main counter ability is a 20% chance proc to restore 20% of his health. His main attack is a 30% absorb damage and increase of 40 spirit for one turn. His 120 ability will reduce enemy AP by 20, which is kind of a survivability factor where if you consider reducing enemy AP faster means they can't use as many abilities, means you don't take as much damage. It's kind of intertwined there. His limit break gives him 60% crit evasion for 3 turns, and he is protect capable on the Grimoire sub, so tons of different ways for him to mitigate damage. Some of those tools are good for physical damage, but overall not impressive compared to other, physical damage tanks. He's a magic tank. For me, the two big things here are the reduced physical damage of 35% the larger the AoE, with the counter ability here to reduce the physical damage 30%. If you have a character like A2 or Eld that has a really nice large physical AoE, he could potentially mitigate that damage by 65% there. That's a lot. But if you're going against a Bridal Elia that's got a single target nuke, there's really nothing there for him to do anything against that. And even the protect capability in the Grimoire sub, protect is so easily dispellable by a variety of meta-defining characters that this is good, but not amazing. So yeah, the physical damage is not his forte, but it's certainly not bad. He's still got a more than enough HP, more than enough self-heals and sustain. He still has a 75 HP barrier, which obviously does apply to physical type damage. But yeah. Well, next bullet. The magic aura is fantastic. That's a 40% damage reduction of magic type for 4 turns to teammates around him, not himself, but to his teammates, which will also grant them 50% resistance to sleep, poison, and slow. Again, three of the most popular status elements right now. This is a fantastic piece of utility. Excellent mid-fight hate generation, where his triple hit will generate 4 hate, which is basically 2 extra hits. Not all tanks get that capability to maintain hate throughout the fight. So yeah, he's got a real cool advantage here that he can sustain that hate throughout a fight in ways that many other tanks can't. The Berserk Limit Break is certainly no joke. We'll talk about that later. Overall, very short range, which makes it so that his second buff is very flexible. This is kind of new for us. A lot of these tanks that we're used to seeing are a little bit longer range, but you have a lot of options for that second buff after he uses his main one, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. You could use the second buff straight up, which is his re-raise and the counter ability here of the physical damage reduction. You could use Protect on the Grimoire sub. You could use his main sub ability, which is an AoE of element res for a couple different elements. You could use a TMR, which I frankly love doing right now for him. He's got great overall utility too. His Select 2 is a Dispel of Protect and Shell, and that decrease of 20 AP. His lowest AP ability is a 70 healing power down. This will help when he's finishing off an enemy so that if they re-raise, they're going to have that 70 healing power down on that 20% health they should re-raise with. It's going to be far less than that. And if you figure if they get maybe healed up by support, that healing power down is still going to sustain itself. So it's very niche, but still certainly a nice thing to consider. I've seen plenty of fights lately where A2 will re-raise and shells will heal her right back up to full. This will help prevent some of that. He's got Seal Barrier Break for teammates, and then he's got Resistance Break on the Red Mage sub. That's a 38% Spirit Apparel and the re-raise remove. And his King's Duty Sequence follow-up, which is tied to that triple hit, his main AoE I keep referencing, is a 25% healing to ally. If there's no ally in range, he'll heal himself. So you get some duality there. But let's go through the passive abilities now. Duty Ordained by Fate is the best one here. That's his main passive ability. 12 Spirit, 12 unit res, 30% debuff weakening, the 5 hate to start off the fight. That will always be on, no matter what. It's really a toss-up what you want next. I prefer the move +1 and the agility because I like to have my tanks get a little bit of separation from their teammates. But being a magic aura type of character, at the same time, you do want him to stay relatively closer to his teammates, so you don't want him to get too far away. So this is very map-specific, matchup-specific, team-specific, but I like the option. But Clandestine Reading is likely my second choice here, just for that 40 Spirit Pen. He's not doing a lot of damage, we'll be honest here, but 40 Spirit Penetration is certainly nice considering he's at 0 innately. The others of these certainly aren't bad options, though I could easily see Mage's Protection or Grimoire Keeper Mastery being used for certain matchups. So overall, I love the variety here. The counter abilities, Nurturing Nectar is probably my favorite, just because it's a way to regen some health in addition to what he already does. So it's a 20% chance to restore 20% of his HP, not including any healing power. Healing power will increase that percentage. The Magic Reflex, though, hard to deny this one, also very good. But to be fair, the Hidden Resistance is a very interesting option. It might seem counterintuitive that you would ever want to reduce your hate by 1, but his main ability increases his hate by 4 throughout the fight. So your still net effect going to be like regenerating hate throughout the fight. So even if you lose 1 here, to trade it off for 40 AoE res, I actually got to play with that one, but all three of these are viable in their own rights. We get to the main job buffs. Yeah, there's a lot to read here, but really boils down to some of those bullet points we already saw. It's a HP barrier, it's the damage reduction on the larger the AoE size, it's the seal barrier for 3 turns, and it's the aura for the magic reduction and these 2 status effects. This is his main ability priority. Always use this. You will always use this anyway. You don't have to worry about it. It's really the second one that I was saying was a toss-up. There's so many ways to remove re-raise nowadays that unless you have a Helena or a Vivi behind him that can re-raise seal, I've actually found that this one is not a great second buff. The counter ability here is certainly nice. This is that 30% physical damage potential reduction, but I've found that there's just as many very impactful TMRs you could potentially use, or even buffs on the sub-job. So this second buff, I don't think is a hard stuck option for him, but we'll keep talking about the abilities here in the main job. Again, very short range, only up to 3 squares away. They're all slash, except for Magi Piercer. And let me pause for a moment. This is a Pierce type attack for a 200% mod that reduces enemy bravery by 30. Let me just do you all a favor right now. Turn this ability off and never turn it back on again, ever. Please, don't even think this ability is god-awful. It's abysmally bad. He should never be prioritizing that ability over anything else in his kit, ever. It's literally like 5th priority. So please turn that ability off. Don't even think about it being there. Triple Drain is that main ability I was talking about. It's a 100% hit chance, restore 30% health. It will cast a sequence follow-up. That is the hate generation and the 25% healing to ally, and it's the 40 spirit for 1 turn. This is a stellar ability. I wish it had more than just 3 casts. It's so good. But dual release is also very good. It's a select 2. The Dispel, Protect, and Shell. We already saw this in the general thoughts. There's a lot to like here on the main job. This block out ability aside. For the limit burst, this is a very good limit burst. It's a 50 slash res pen, which means his AI will naturally prioritize it because he's got no other slash res pen in his kit. It's the 67% chance to inflict Berserk and the crit evade of 60. I'll be honest, I have faced a fair amount of A2 teams with Dario. You'd think that's a bad matchup going wind into an ice unit, but very frequently that A2 will be leading the front line. She'll get berserked by Dario to start that fight, and she's not nearly the threat that you would think her to be. Now, obviously, this limit break doesn't get the same kind of value if it's a generic tank in front of you or a relatively weaker character, but still, Berserk is so game-changing. This is a very, very good thing for him to have. Now for the sub-jobs, the double deprivation, this is another Pierce type attack. I don't mind this one though, because disable is actually not a bad status effect to be inflicting here. No one really defends against it anymore. But I'm really just bringing attention to this for this buff. That's the wind, earth, and light res of 25%. It's a nice square-shaped buff. I can absolutely see instances where if you have Dario in the middle as your slowest unit, you have 2 teammates that go to teammate buff him. He then uses this buff to start on the 3 of them, and then he still has time to use his main buff. I actually like that turn rotation. I think this is a good option. The Red Mage sub, this is really for resistance break. I would not keep Kira on. He's not going to be healing for really anything. He's got no healing power innately. His magic stat is pretty trash. Maybe keep Asuna on, but really that's it. Resistance break is really the best ability here. And Grimoire Keeper, I really only like this for the attritional protection, where this is again further AP reduction upon hit. It's the protect. There is another 100% hit chance here. It's okay. Obviously inferior to his other one. Archaic Healing, though, is another option. I don't necessarily mind this one either, but again, his magic stat's pretty low, so I'm not really looking into it. This is kind of whatever. I'd really just stick with a Resistance Break and call it a day as a sub-job. Now for the TMR review, this is an armor-type TMR. It's basically a form of like the Vega TMR, where it grants Shell, and it's a 25% chance to inflict silence. Any character that can equip armor can use this. I low-key love this TMR. I don't think it's as debilitating as the Vega TMR, because Berserk obviously has implications for both physical and magic damage dealers, whereas this one really only affects mages. But man, you're going into a mage meta and you want a random chance to inflict silence that they may not be expecting. This TMR, don't sleep on it. This is a good one. Now for the job-based vision cards, Katana actually has a ton of vision cards. It's always been a question of what they really align best with. Staff Black Mage is definitely the best synergy at the moment. There is a small one here with Sword Red Mage. It's really just based upon one AoE card though, but there's so many other cards in common, and Katana units obviously skew similarly to Sword Red Mage, that they're both slash type units, that there's a lot of team synergy there for the rest of these vision cards. Mace also 3 for 3 on in terms of overlap. Dagger is very slightly there, but it's not there yet. I'd wait on it, but it's probably one of the closer ones to being filled out. But yeah, there's a lot of great applications here to weave a Katana unit in, and we'll see one of them in the sample builds. But for now, the general optimization is just stick with the Morningstar Katana. That's his weapon. I like this weapon best. It gives him 20 slash and Spirit Pen and unit res. You're not going to get better than that. Heaven's Cloud is not better than that. So honorable mention, but Morningstar Katana is definitely the best. The other equips, Maximilian Armor is by far my favorite. I think it's far superior to the Brigandine or even the pod accessories here, but there are valuable options in those, so obviously entertain them. The Espers, my 2 favorite are Dark Siren and Greater Demon, but being a tank, Esper is entirely matchup specific. Are you going for a certain kind of elemental res for your matchup? Are you going for a certain agility tuning? Are you hedging for a certain kind of weapon type resistance like pierce res or strike res? It's so matchup specific that I'm not even going to give recommendations outside of these 2, which I do think are the most generally applicable in the modern era of the game. And finally, the TMR recommendations. I mentioned I actually like using TMRs on him because I do like some of these matchups, him not using that re-raise buff if I know the re-raise is going to get removed. These are a lot of TMRs that I'm a big fan of. A couple of these give element res for a variety of elements. His own TMR I like for that anti-mage matchup. The Dialdo TMR, although I hate his pierce attack, which is bravery down, this buff to apply bravery down in addition to all your attacks, I actually do value that. Its net effect about a 30% damage decrease against physical damage in addition to the counter chance reduction. So yeah, there's a lot of TMRs. There's obviously more than just this. It's just a couple that came to my mind as immediate favorites. But as we get into the sample builds here now, this is the mono wind version. First off, you throw him with 2 pierce units. I love this matchup. You have a ton of vision card flexibility, but I do like gearing this team for a little bit of anti-evasion, so that's why I have the luck card of the 2B card here in the main slot. The sub-vision cards you could certainly flex with, but equips, I went with the Maximilian Armor, I went with the Vega TMR, I went with the Move +1 passive here for him, and then I went Spirit Set and Agility. We're going to talk about these rune choices on the next slide, but I have Poison Res here, and I have a Mobilize Res for the A2 limit break. That last thing I want is Dario getting immobilized, so I'm hedging against that. But stat-wise here, 14,000 HP. You love to see it. 47 defense, 50 spirit, little over 1,000 magic, 104 agility, not the worst spot for a tank. The dex and luck are what they are. The rest of these stats, 35 unit res, 40 AoE res, certainly a nice spot for him to be in to start off with. Up to 40% strike res here, but that does get more easily penetrated nowadays than it had historically. The rest of this, the mods are kind of whatever. I'm not really looking out for mods. He's up to 40 Spirit Pen here because of his weapon, but I believe it's also the Sadali Vision card, also giving him additional Spirit Pen. That's certainly nice. 45% debuff weakening. The Maximilian Armor gives the 10% damage reduction above a certain HP threshold. So this is a very healthy build for a Dario. This is a very good team, quite frankly, as well. This is going to beat a lot of things you're likely seeing across the game. But the second option I love is the good old-fashioned Vivi Helena, a Vivi Lena team, where I don't know if he's an upgrade to Raph. He's a different kind of tank than Raph, different kind of matchup. He does take some steps back here in a stat perspective, and I wanted to talk to something interesting. I have the Halloween Lucia vision card here for Helena Vivi. This does not apply to Dario though, so he's not getting that unit res, but he's got enough between his weapon, his passive. You could put on a TMR that gives unit res as well. He's at 25 right now. Not the end of the world, but yeah, this build generally speaking is just trying to like min-max the Helena Vivi optimization. I did switch up a couple things here. I put the Brigandine armor on him instead of the Maximilian armor, and I switched up the passive so that he's not a move +1. This will give him the 40 Spirit Pen instead. And so yeah, stat-wise, it does take a small step back on the HP where you're losing some of that vision card HP percent, but also the mastery of the 2 wind units. Still 42 defense, 50 spirit, more magic in this build because of the 2 vision cards here on Vivi. 104 agility is exactly the same. That 25 unit res, 49 AoE res still, up to 87% reaction block. The resistances here much higher on the slash res, up at 52%. He still ends up at 60 Spirit Pen, certainly nice to see. And the debuff weakening is a little bit higher at 60% because of the Shinryu vision card. But overall, this is still a very good build for a tank. It's just a totally different kind of team, obviously, where you're likely trying to beat out other kinds of teams. But last thing here to touch upon is the Truststones. Left side here, pretty standard. Go with HP, luck, element, res of one kind and of a second kind. Go with 2 different status effects. I personally like the 25% poison because that'll get him to 35% innately. I also chose the immobilize, as I mentioned, for the A2 limit break, but really you could put anything there for another status effect. And the right side, this is a very different approach because he's a tank. There is some in here that I don't normally have, but a lot of it's because his weapon already has the penetrations that I want him to have. So magic 20%, I'm going accuracy of 10. I never put accuracy on any units here. In almost no circumstances is accuracy of 10 one of the 6 best things you should put on here, but for him it actually is. I would recommend that, the reaction block, the healing power, the wind attack 10, and the slash attack 10. He's got no slash attack on his weapon, so you couldn't put that here. This obviously would change a fair bit if you weren't equipping his weapon. I would likely want some Spirit Pen and some Slash Res Pen, which I have here in the other section, but you don't need the Dex 15, you don't need the acquired AP, you don't need the crit rate or the crit damage. None of those things are going to affect his performance in really any material way. So yeah, you can really put in the accuracy of 10 here and actually get some benefit from it. But that's the Dario, the Crystalborn review. This is a very interesting character. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy using him. I don't think he's going to take over the game by any means, but he's going to be a very solid staple for quite some time. We very obviously see a lot of tank units, particularly with these aura abilities, really come into their own and have some competitive advantage over their other tank or even DPS counterparts. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll talk to y'all later.